At again did I ask? um, yeah, Ben already answered it like really comprehensively. Well, thank you so much for that. But if you haven't seen it, the question of the week is: if you've participated in MOOCs or boot camps before, those kind of, how was your learning experiences there, and what do you think they'd look like as public goods? You know, because I want everyone to to relate to the topic somewhat. I'll paste it again here in this thread. Does anyone want to share? Has anyone like attended, like tried to finish a course or attended the boot camp? Me, during the pandemic, I signed up for a lot, but I didn't finish any at all, which made me feel really bad because I love free education. I mean, YouTube University, I'm all here for that, but yes, it just didn't work for me. And I didn't know why until I researched this essay. How about the rest?
I'm happy.
I've definitely.
Yeah, you go.
Oh,
you
sorry.
go. Go in, Gary, for sure.
All right. So I was just going to say that I've definitely tried doing some online courses versus just like searching around on the internet, trying to learn different things. And the online course tends to be, in my opinion, a lot like more memorable because the information is like structured in this way where one topic builds on the next. So it's like sort of easier to remember. Whereas like just Googling around and reading things is awesome if you're looking for something specific. But if you're trying to learn like an entire subject matter, doesn't really get there. So I like online courses. Also have never finished one, but we get far enough that like we learn something new. So that's all.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like that level of curation, like having a structure is so valuable, especially since the internet is saturated with information. We don't have like enough time in the world to like navigate all that is possible there. So of course when you're a beginner trying to learn a skill on the internet, you're bound to make a lot of like beginner mistakes if you just try to do things on your own, which is why having that kind of structure, or even better, having a mentor or a teacher to talk to is great, very valuable. Yeah. Anyone else like to share?
I've done a bunch of boot camps, and I feel like there's sort of like tiers to it in that there's like YouTube University, general curiosity, learning through doing on the internet as like something that we all do if we're in the space at the very least. You know, we're in the public goods library, we read and are curious online. But I've also done like literal like vocational boot camps where it's like you pay to, like the two boot camps I've done, one is a data science boot camp. You get a certificate in being a data scientist. I got my work to pay for it. And I feel like there's some sort of like B2B inflation of like, because mostly corporations are paying for these boot camps, like the prices are artificially inflated. But that's a different conversation. Another interesting conversation I feel like is I did this weird sort of boot camp where it was like, so I work in advertising strategy, and the only way that I could get a job in advertising strategy is by taking this certificate program in advertising strategy, where it was just like, it's just honestly like networking with extra steps, because it's like more so getting introduced to people than it is like learning an educational thing, which I think honestly is helpful if it's like not taken through an educational lens, and it's like this is literally professional certification so that you can get a job, and it's like they don't sell the guise of it being education. But I do think that there's like I like the fast food metaphor that you brought up, because it's like void of nutritional information is like what these fast food educational curriculum feel like, and in that a lot of it's like copy and pasted. Like there's like the rise of like the core curriculum that is just, you know, copy of like I think that it was brought up in your article that there's like some programming bedrock that like a lot of different things just change the interfaces around, and I was like, that feels like fast food, and then like devoid of nutritional information. But yeah, I mean, it's really interesting with like boot camps and all that stuff, and like the just like I don't know, like I don't think that I was trying to look into education as a public good, and it's like higher education or any education that's not like provided by the state is like by definition not a public good, because it's like your seat in in a university class is rivalrous. Like there's only 30 amount of seats, and like your seat takes away a seat from someone else. And so like with that framing, everything is like sort of privatized education. Nothing really is like the only public education is like curiosity online, which then you can sort of, I don't know, maybe create certificates for, but I don't know. Those are my 2 cents on educational boot camps and all that type of stuff. I think they're useful, but I also think that they're kind of like emblematic of a system that's kind of fucked up. So yeah, a little bit of both.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Definitely. Okay. It's actually a good segue. I want to first talk about like why these programs even exist. Anyways, again, it's all about access, because traditional education itself is a merit good, right? Not only is it not everyone can get in, but not everyone can afford it. Also, just why programs like MOOCs and boot camps were offered to people who couldn't get in like the traditional way. Just like how fast food was made for people who like couldn't afford better conditions of food, right? However, even if they market themselves as doing good, like, oh, we're providing education to those who can't traditionally access, we're helping improve the system. I argued in this essay that this kind of education can actually be crippling for them, according to George Ritzer here, this kind of rational system, because fast food education is made from the process of McDonaldization, which is how the process of how fast food restaurants work, they apply to other parts of society. They deny basic humanity. So how did they do that? First, again, the questionable quality, because they prioritize time more than quality. Because these people want to graduate as soon as possible in order to find a job, but because of that, the quality of the curriculum is sacrificed. So, for instance, skipping fundamentals, conventional slides. Yeah, that's why Lambda, which is now known as Bloom School, they got exposed by one of their students. Like, why is the content here? I can find this online, like. And it's even worse because like they're making use of like public good, like this free information, and then turning it into a merit good, right? Like something people eventually have to pay for. Next, homogenization. Students are pressured to fit the norm because of the standards set by the institution. So related to this is I'll put some quotes from the Schooling Society. Wait, let me paste it here in the thread. I will read it out loud. Many students, especially those who are poor, intuitively know what the schools will for them. They school them to confuse process and substance. That can be seen here. For instance, in UX design boot camps, students end up like focusing more on the process, like, oh, I know how to do research. I know how to put a template, instead of like showing their own taste, their own thinking process as a designer. So once these become blurred, a new logic is assumed. The more treatment there is, the better the results. Escalation leads to success. The pupil is thereby schooled to confuse teaching with learning. A great advance in education, a diploma with competence, and fluency of the ability to say something new. His imagination is schooled to accept service in place of value. Yeah, that last line. Let's just let that sink in. And that made me think like, especially the learning with teaching part. Here's another quote that expands on this. Most learning is not the result of instruction. It is rather the result of unhampered participation in a meaningful setting. Most people learn best by being with it, yet school makes them identify their personal cognitive growth with elaborate planning and manipulation. And that made me think of how we all are learning in the web-free space. Like none of us like went to a college or school or something. All of us went here because we were of our own interest. And heck, even in web too, like most developers, hackers I know, they started learning how to code because they just want to, maybe do something fun in Minecraft or do their own thing, not because they were told to. And I feel like the best developers were those who just like did their own thing and just had fun. Recently, I remember last year, I was being critical of another like local coding bootcamp in my country. Me and my friends were kind of making criticizing it because we saw the portfolios of some of the students who graduated from the local coding bootcamp, and we noticed that it was very templated projects. Like if you compared this student and that student, you couldn't tell the difference because they had the same portfolio. So sure, you can do the work, but how can I tell you apart from everyone else, right? So that's how I feel like these kind of edtech programs are crippling them by making them like all the same. I see a lot of shared thoughts. Before I continue, does anyone want to like quip in anything?
Yeah, I just wanted to say something that I do see a lot throughout the space, specifically for Web3, is indeed that approach of building things out of interest as well as necessity, right? I internally, I think that's actually how a lot of people do gain coding experience in many ways, is they find themselves in a position to either solve a problem or are tasked with solving a problem and have to just sort of figure it out. And we dealt with that internally. We have someone who now codes as a result of the fact that we needed to build an internal tool at our organization, and they just took on the task and scoured GitHub repos and figured out how to like sort of hack something together, and now they're developing, which is kind of amazing. So it is, yes, thank you for that. It is something that I think happens out of a out of obligation in some ways, and so as a result, like it's interesting because open source coding a lot of the times and open source software comes about as a necessity for solving problems, and so it sort of has like a mutualist angle to it, where people group together to solve things out of an obligation to do so. And I do think that that's what sometimes inspires people to get into writing code is also solving problems, and it can be a very fun problem. It can be what many people would phrase as like a relatively meaningless problem, but it is a really great way for people to get into it, be interested. Like maybe that's not the fast food approach, right? Like how do you get people taking on tasks that they are not necessarily familiar with in order to learn something? Because I think that's definitely like the slow food approach to learning how to do something.
Yeah, and I wish traditional education was the same because right now I'm also a computer science student, and unfortunately, my grades in the comp science subjects are the lowest because the way a teacher would teach them, they just like read these slides and then maybe like demonstrate the code at the same time. But I had a hard time like following everything because there was no interest. I couldn't figure out like why should I care about this anyways? And it just felt so restricting because it was like, oh, you solve this, you solve that, you do these requirements. So yeah, that's why I'm really passionate about education, how to like redesign it for the better, because I really do not want anyone else to live out like such a painful experience. Because I'm sure coding is fun, but if people like get the wrong approach, like they may like be appalled to it for life, which is like really sad. Like imagine all the potential you can do with such a skill, right?
Right. I mean, I think the main thing that you're pointing to there is that people gain a lot from achievement that is contributory. When you do something that's templated, right? Like in along your approach from just taking like a class, like you don't get the payoff from the work that you did necessarily. Like, yes, you built something, but no one's going to use it. So what does it mean? By contrast, when you build something and people use it, that's really rewarding. So that's sometimes like maybe that's the more sustainable approach, is to give people problems that need to be solved and say, hey, like this class is going to be all of us trying to figure out how to solve this problem that we don't have a solution to. You're not going to come out of this course with necessarily, you're not going to come out of this course with necessarily like we're going to grade you based on whether or not you came close to solving the problem, because we don't have a solution. That might be more interesting.
Agreed. Yeah, and that's the way to get people more involved into building public goods, because for sure the impact there is definitely something that can be more seen. Anyone else who wants to like share their thoughts before I continue on with my summary, or we good?
I can share a bit. So, like 5 years ago, I've attended a developer bootcamp, and we had no teachers. So the idea was that we would learn by teaching to others and by doing. So we had some kinds of customers that were coming up with a problem, and we had to build an application that would provide a solution, but the customers were not expecting a result. Maybe they would get something about after 6 months, but it was more to practice. And then also the hackathons were playing a big role, because then again it was just about building out of an idea that wasn't already out there. Also figuring out how to work as a team, because when you're in a hackathon, maybe it's not just 5 developers. Some people had already some previous coding background, or others were coming from, I don't know, political studies or whatever. So
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. All right, let me continue. And finally, the last reason why I feel like these kind of edtech programs are crippling students is because of inequity. Because one, they already elevate existing digital divides. There are two digital divides. First, in terms of access, like do they have the technology and the connection, and second, in terms of how much people can use them. Because according to studies done, the more affluent students are able to make use of like these technological resources more for more advanced purposes, like for instance creating something or like learning how to code, versus like those who are less affluent, they tend to use the tech for basic purposes, like for instance like not creating, because what else do they know, right? And what else? I believe that they also sustain the capitalistic system in a way, because again related to this, because of this kind of homogenization curriculum, it tries to make all the students workers, right? Because the goal of these boot camps or these MOOCs is to get a job. That's all that they're taught to aim for, arguably. Let me get this quote about the Learn for Code movement. Elite trade. Okay, this is a relevant quote from my essay. Let me read it out loud. Researcher Matthew Kim argues that the Learn to Code movement is actually a colonial civilizing mission in disguise. Elites like, let's say, the Zuckerbergs at Meta, they want more diverse coders, not just because they want, not because of universal progress, but because they want to save on labor costs and access to new markets, which is why Silicon Valley is fond of outsourcing to the global south. This reminds me of a recent thread I saw. So I'm from the Philippines, and this guy called Swati Startup, he tweeted this informational thread about, oh, you want to save costs on your startup, just hire people from the Philippines, which is really questionable advice. Thankfully, he deleted it because he got called out. Like, why pay us less when we do as much work, right? Yeah, this is called ghost work. But even with fewer barriers to entry, there are still standards that are enforced by the capitalist system. Like, for instance, those who have technical skills already, they divide according to dispensability. So, for instance, those who are not engineers, of course, will be less valued as those who already have engineering skills. But those who don't have skills at all, they're just seen as deficient. Like, oh, you cannot maneuver this technological world. Well, sucks to be you, right? Yeah, and this also extends to the students because when they're trained, they see these other people without skills as like underdeveloped. Like, oh, they don't know how to navigate this world. Well, that's why they need to be empowered, right? They need my technical skills. So this can lead to reductive seduction, where the students oversimplify others' problems by assuming that they can build solutions for them. Techno solutionism, which is why I remember seeing at the start of the pandemic all these like COVID related projects, like, oh, here's another contact tracer. I'm not sure how useful those were, especially in abundance, but making solutions for and not with people in need only ends up hurting them, perpetuating existing inequalities. Yes. Ooh, good quip from Ryan, where if we're not training laborers, what should we aim at? Yes, my answer is that we should be growing responsible citizens instead of those who are ready to be builders and stewards of the goods. Anyone who wants to share their thoughts on this, like related to this?
I feel like, and this is just sort of like a half-baked, loosely formed thought, but I feel like what the nature or ethos of open source does really well for the curiosity of education is like only focusing on edge cases, in that it's like all about solving a certain problem really well, and then through composability, like being relevant. So it's like having an intentionally narrow focus such that it augments a greater whole, whereas education or whatever sort of like reinforces the whole itself, and it's not like pushing outwards at the edges and like searching for meaning. It's like just trying to boilerplate, give like a sort of there's just an interesting tension of like overgeneralification and like oversimplification being I guess antithetical to education. And so just some thoughts that I have jumbling around in my head.
Yeah, it's again related to the learning is not most learning is like not teaching code from deschooling society. I believe that you need to give students like space to grow and explore in order to develop for the better. And if you constrain them too much, you put them into this cookie cutter. They won't be able to grow to their full potential. And unfortunately, most schools they tend to be at cookie cutter. That in the startup funding world, I've seen what
Ryan, did you want to say something?
companies. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Ryan?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yes.
I don't think
Oh.
we did before.
Thumbs up.
Cool. Yeah, so one of the things that I always talk about when it comes up that we're educating and we're training for laborers is that a large part of most curricula is structural. So in a traditional elementary school, this is really easy to see that like the structural curriculum is about listening to an authority, sitting and being quiet, asking for permission to go to the bathroom, and moving when the bell rings. And this has a direct mirror to laboring in a factory. You know, you have to be where you want to be, where the bell rings, don't speak, listen to the boss. And that structurally, if we want to be training people to be good citizens to build a better world, that structure is obsolete and harmful and wrong-headed. And alternative structures that give students real power to actually solve problems and the opportunity to build real solutions and fail and get feedback are much more effective, but much harder to financialize.
Yeah, I think you're getting at the meat of kind of what fast food education and cookie cutter driven education kind of points you toward, right? Which is that realistically, when you want to have people be educated on cookie cutter approaches to learning, it's really just to fit people into what a standard is for the capitalist extraction method of having people learn how to code. But if you have people understand that code is a form of expression and a form of creating things, maybe you actually have people who are more engaged with it on the level of solutioning and creativity to approaches. So something along those lines, I think. Ollie, I think I saw you unmute for a moment. Did you want to say something, Ollie? If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
Yeah, maybe something's up with your mic. Or if you can't figure it out, you can type it out here, then like we can voice it.
They just left, so I think they'll probably jump back in a second.
I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, actually, Ryan, what you said, very good segue into what I believe is a better education aside from these programs. They should aim to make not just workers, but also people. And this can be seen, for instance, in an initiative like the Learning Collective with an anti-boot camp. But before I talk about Tech Learning Collective, let me connect this quote from the Schooling Society, very relevant. Universal education through schooling is not feasible. It would be no more feasible if it were attempted by means of alternative institutions, but on the style of present schools. So they're talking about our EdTech programs here. Neither new attitudes of teachers towards their pupils, nor the proliferation of educational hardware or software. So no matter how much cool like tech, especially whenever you bring to education, if it's like the same like structure, the same system, nothing's going to change. Nor finally the attempt to expand the pedagog's responsibility until it engulfs his pupils' lifetimes and deliver universal education. The current search for new educational funnels must be reversed into the search for the institutional inverse. Educational webs which heighten the opportunity for each one to transform each moment of his living into one of learning, sharing, and caring. Just like how Ryan talks about growing responsible citizens who want to be builders and stewards of public goods. And thank you for sharing this Finland model. I've always admired their approach to everything, not just education, but also their prisoners. They, instead of going for punishment, they go for a rehabilitation approach, I think, and I find that very helpful. I believe people get the most not through like violence or like being forced to do things, but through care. Yeah, what you guys say?
Education should be rehabilitative and like make you greater than your original self. And like there are weird parallels about this whole like education as like a laborer factory, like being ready in line, where it's like it feels like ask any kid waking up 8 a.m. on a Monday and they'll tell you school feels like jail.
I dropped that. Yeah. I dropped that talking point because people always oppose it when I compare schools to prisons. But prisoners have rights. Children don't get to leave. They have far fewer rights. That doesn't win me any friends, so I drop that narrative usually. But there's a direct parallel between a state and a society's attitude towards schools and prisons. And no more is this more apparent than in the US, where people talk about the school to prison pipeline. Let the children be free. Would it be so bad if you just let them sleep in or go home? Like, they need to be there against their will?
Yeah, so this is Gary. I work with high schoolers. That's like my main thing I do, and this is outside of the classroom setting, through Civics Unplugged and DreamDAO, and we find that it takes a lot of time for them to get out of the bluntly kind of a prisoner's mindset where they only do what they're told to do. I mean, there's some young people that have learned, I guess, probably outside of school to do otherwise. But I think it's telling. I didn't know. I didn't work with kids a few years ago. But it's telling that it's like they get surprised when like an adult believes in them, and it's like, hey, you figure it out, and like, um, I think the fact that school is not training these muscles for the most part is extremely troubling.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of staff operate like under, oh, if I suffered like this, I had to figure out things on my own, then, the next generation should do the same. I don't think we should be perpetuating this kind of cycle. Right? Stop the status quo. Yeah.
It's sort of a Gordian knot on how to break that cycle. I've been interviewing parents for many years about what assurances they would need to take their kids from the traditional schooling system and put them into something a little more forward thinking. And for most parents, even considering it is so beyond the pale because they're like, well, how will my kid have the accepted signals for getting a job? And
100%.
when I say like I don't have those signals, but I'm employed, they're like, well, that's just you. And I'm like, but it's kind of a non-starter.
Yeah.
One of the strongest forces for like against homeschooling is not even just like the certification, but like to exist in society, you need a little bit of society institutionalization, and like it's a way to socialize people in a way through introducing them to these I don't know, just like I feel like that's the strongest push against homeschooling is that it's like it introduces you to the rigid society that you're a part of. And like that you need to,
Yeah. They better start getting oppressed early so they can get used to it.
Yeah, so that's super fucked up. So to Ryan's point about how hard it is to get people to transfer to an alternate form of education, I think it's like it's very hard to get them outside of like a traditional high school. But like when they're about to graduate from high school, we've actually succeeded in getting a few of our like alumni from our like high school programming to do gap years with us like full time, and the key there is to actually pay them like a meaningful salary. But otherwise, I don't see, because then the parents can be like, okay, well, I respect work, and so you got to appeal to another part of themselves. But to get them to like do an alternate education where they're just like, trust us, it's gonna be free education. They're not gonna get paid like that. What I found is that that's really hard.
Another thing that we're not considering here is the emotional I want to say trauma necessarily, but when I talk to parents about having an alternative outcome, an alternative life path for their kids, they say, well, I went through the traditional path and I turned out fine. Therefore, your advocacy of any other alternative is like a tacit condemnation of who I have become. And that's like really hard to untangle.
It's funny because a lot of the time I think what it comes down to is people's unwillingness to recognize individual experiences as foundational to how people become people. Like, it doesn't matter where you came from, as long as you become a relatively decent person at the end of it. Like, obviously, I think there's a lot of, you can talk about trauma, and I think institutional educational systems can come loaded with a ton of trauma. And I think honestly, like, you can say the same thing for homeschooling systems. I'm aware of many people who were highly traumatized by having gone through that. and many who also benefited from it. But despite that fact, like I think people don't put enough emphasis on recognizing that each person's journey to being a person is different. And so when you believe that because you went through something, you quote unquote turned out fine, you're essentially removing agency from people to have different experiences other than yours. So
I
it's
I feel like
that?
I just feel like I have a nuclear take. Is that if people don't have shared experiences rooted in events, spaces, time, or like whatever, like then they have to like relate to people through their emotions, and like we as a society are not prepared for that. It's just like we need to have like institutional background so that we can like make small talk over shared experience. Otherwise, it'd be like, well, tell me how this made you feel, and like no one wants to go there, and so we just like accept the like shittiness of like a background that we can like sort of make small talk around. Just feels kind of weird.
Well, it's like like you're very right because I mean that's another question to ask here when it comes to like education, when it comes from MOOCs or these boot camps is if you take them online, how do you connect with other people in the class? I've like in my online courses, like I've been a part of Discord channels. Sometimes where the Discord channel is like entirely used to game the system and not actually learn anything, which is another thing to be talked about when it comes to these. Right? But nonetheless, like having these structures in place that are like you don't have the social aspect to learning, and the social aspect is important to learning. It's a huge part of what helps you affirm whether or not you know what you know. And so that is kind of missing sometimes, and that's why I think that like maybe an approach that is about collective solutioning would be a better approach. Like I know that there are a bunch of alternative education programs that like I don't remember what it's called. It's called like the Montessori school, right? Like the whole idea behind the Montessori school is supposed to be like alternative education through situations based learning. You explore a car crash from every conceivable angle, for example. Um, like how does it work on the ethical front? How does it work on the mechanical front? How does it work on the physical front? How does it work on the political front? Like all the things that go into an event, and you explore it from that angle. And so I think that a lot of times we think that education has to be rote, right? And unfortunately, that's a broad paintbrush approach, and we don't really get people who have that social aspect to education. Maybe that's the biggest problem with fast food education is that like you go to a nice restaurant because you want the care that's put into the food. You go to a fast food restaurant because you need food.
Yeah, other especially in my country, like eating out is not just like just to eat out. It's because it's a social experience. It's a way of a family bonding. That's why whenever there are holidays, people always over prepare food because it's not that. It's not that they don't want to waste food. On they don't want to waste food on purpose. It's that it helps facilitate that kind of experience. The food is just the accessory for the connection, and I feel like similar with education. Uh, the most value I've gained from alternative learning experiences, like for instance, the Kernel Fellowship is not the resources provided per se, but the connections I made while doing the fellowship. And I think without having that cohort experience, even if I was provided with the same like curriculum and like same talks, it just wouldn't be the same. I wouldn't have like learned as much. I'm sure other fellows feel the same here. Yeah.
Relationships are absolutely the key, and having someone that you can work directly with, like one-on-one relationships, I've found have been the absolute most impactful. And creating frameworks to enable that. Like at Developer DAO, it's really easy for someone to come in and say like, oh, I've been reading a lot of material about being a developer, and I can say like, let's set up a session so that I can get you actually working towards a goal. Like that's really easy. But in the public goods space, setting up one-on-one mentorships is a lot less well-defined. Because if someone comes up and says like, I've been reading a ton about public goods and I want to get involved, who is the right kind of mentor for someone like that? I don't know. Is anyone here mentoring anyone in public goods or in general?
I have a bunch of people reach out to me on LinkedIn that I am like a quasi mentor to. That like I'm happy to always take any calls if anyone's like, "Hey, you want to talk about how you got your job?" I'm like, yeah, for sure, I'll do that. But that's definitely a passive mentor versus an active mentor. There's like some really beautiful active mentors that are just like beyond, because I feel like what this has been making me think is that education is like a slow, like a long form expression of identity, because it's like where your thoughts want to go, and like giving the proper thoughts, like routing the proper way so that you can let your creative expression for where your thoughts want to go, giving it that like structure is like a process that requires both like your own participation but like a reflection through other people, and like it's a weird sort of framing for education as like
there's something here that I think is okay. So like, what do you conceive of when you think of the college education, right? Like, what do you do when you go to college? There's two approaches people usually take. You either pick a degree that'll get you a job, or you pick a degree you're interested in. Sometimes they're the same thing. But like the point you're making, and I think this is like super important, is good education starts you off with that principle of seeking something that you want to learn from the outset versus something that people tell you need to learn to be a part of society. And unfortunately, a lot of people go through the college education, their career in college education, thinking that what you're doing is getting ready to do a job. And sometimes that's the case. But oftentimes they come out of it with this collective sense, this deep sense of ennui, because like, what was the point of getting the degree? Now you have to go get the job experience. So why didn't you just go learn something you were interested in?
I feel like one of the best pieces of advice my dad gave me before going to college was that he was like, if you get a 4.0, I'll be disappointed in you because it means you missed the point of college, which is not like education, but the many different people from different backgrounds sharing the same foreground, and like using that as like a way to like connect with other people. Like that's extremely as important, if not more important, than things that you learn is like some of the best boot camps that I've been in, they've taken people that have very similar desires, dreams, and motivations and put them in a cohort so that they can like cross-reference themselves against other people and have like, oh, I'm different than this person because I have a lean towards this. Or like it allows individuation through counterexamples by giving you a cohort, which is kind of a like education can just be like a long form expression of identity where it doesn't even have to be as much learning it's like learning who you are as much as like is learning the things that make those I don't know, attributes, identifiers, tags. But neat thought process. I don't know.
Yeah.
Got to a place.
Bianca, where would you like to guide this from here? Since we have like about
Oh, yes, actually, I would like to talk more about, alternative education initiatives. So even if, amazing programs like the Technolearning Collective and Kernel exist, they aren't enough to address inequity, because that's why a lot of people still eat fast food, because mass distribution simply outweighs all the other costs. And I think same applies to current web-free educational efforts as well, because they still are technically merit goods, because they're valorous. Like you can't, not everyone can be accepted into the fellowship because the quality would drop right? And there is still the problem of access. Like, what about those who don't have as much technical skill or knowledge? Or what if, some educational initiatives in Web3, they're token gated, and that's already exclusive in and of itself. So yeah, I made this little graph, talking about if this is fast food education and this is fine dining education, aka like traditional education. In the middle, we would have these smaller and more tailored initiatives. So if we go with the food metaphor, I see these as like your little cozy local independent restaurants. They're not fast food, but they're not too expensive either. Like they're just right. They're a good place to have an experience. So examples of these are experimental schools, fellowships like Kernel, and communities. In order to I guess tackle this kind of systemic problem, we definitely need to support and help grow more of these in order to accommodate like all the people who would benefit from such an experience. Yeah. No. Wait, what else? But yeah, in short, like what I said, education is not a product that I believe that can be offered or sold or token gated to anyone, but it's a process, and a lifelong one at that. So that's why I believe not everyone should be forced to partake in like shallow learning, because everyone deserves a nutritious education, not just like one time but for life. Yeah, and I hope to hopefully do this somewhat in Web3, because the space has a lot of potential for improving like such systems, and yeah, I'm very excited for that. Anyone else have thoughts to share?
Do a little clap, 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 snap, snap, snap. Thank you so much, Bianca.
Yeah, I really
Thank you. Oh, and I really love the convo going on in the thread right now, talking about auditing. Yeah, I like how Sid said Web3 lets you audit in different Discords and groups. That was definitely part of my whole onboarding experience. Like, I signed up, I joined all these Discords, see which one fit, and I didn't feel bad about dropping any. Yeah, it's what being able to customize a kind of learning experience for me. It was empowering, versus like being forced to learn something I didn't really care about. Yeah.
I think there's like a quote that's like, "Don't let education get in the way of your learning," or something like that. But this is just
Yeah, don't let school get in the way of your education or something.
yeah, something like that. And I just like if I'm in this call right now, I'm obviously really excited about learning and love to. I think that learning only becomes like there's sort of like this. You guys know Nabokov, the guy who wrote Lolita. He said that rereading is the only form of reading. So it's only like once you go over something again that you truly understand it. And so like read something is like chill, whatever, but I only understand it through talking about it with a group and seeing how a bunch of people react to it. And so this is like my ideal form of education because I think more than anything, it's not like masterization, understanding how people respond to certain information is the nuance of like what education for me has become.
So there's something great here. I honestly think Sid also suggested this in the thread. Lonnie, would you like to talk about art education and like how you think about it? I mean, if you're able to do so, just because I do think that's something that like deserves expanding.
Very interesting topic. Yeah.
Hey y'all, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation, Bianca. So I'm I am an artist. I did not study art in school. I studied philosophy. And it's been an interesting journey for me. I was sort of invited into my art practice about like 7, 8, 9 years ago now. Someone invited me to make work, and I was working as a photographer at the time, so like adjacent, but I wasn't practicing as an artist. And I went through, I've gone through like many years of like imposter syndrome and insecurity as a result of that career path and educational path in tandem, because especially in the capital A art world, there's this very elitist mindset and language present frequently around like speaking about art and art history and the context of everything. And part of I will say, maybe like to start with, a benefit of traditional art education is it prepares you to interface with that reality. But it also, as in the article that Sid posted, can create a great deal of I will say like intellectual overanalyzation of your own art practice. And I've seen a lot of artists become intractably stuck in that overthinking of their own process. And so for many years, I was carrying sort of like a chip on my shoulder of not having gone through that formal educational process coming into my own art practice. But at this moment, I've arrived in a place of gratitude for the path that I've taken. And I feel that if I had gone through that traditional learning environment, I think it probably would have been severely limiting to my own creativity, as is, has been coming up about many of these educational systems that we've been speaking about this morning. That the rigid dogma and also the limitations of like who has access to it, like there's all these conditions that, I don't know, I've come to appreciate the fact that I didn't take that path, and also appreciate my degree in philosophy, which I'll say like my feedback for what we've talked about so far. I think like one of the emerging ideas that I'm sensing, and something I've thought about for a long time, is that, if we could shift our educational models to teach kids how to think, not what to think, and to make their educational process more dynamic and participatory in nature, that they have a sense of agency, that would likely yield the kind of societal outcomes that we're all seeking. Like, I uniquely went to UC Santa Cruz, where you could actually build your own major, which I unfortunately didn't have the sense to do at the time, which, sometimes when we're 18 and in college, you don't always realize what a cool opportunity things are. But you could basically create your whole own major, and like, I feel like ideas like that, where people are invited to creatively design or architect their own educational career, including in the arts, like that would be a much richer output in society.
Do you have any examples of people that designed their own curriculums, what they designed, or like just any examples? Because like I think Indiana University also has that, and I know that someone studied magic, which is something that necessarily commonly taught, but I'm just curious as to like what self-taught curriculums would even cover.
Yeah, you could literally do anything. I mean, you had to get it approved, and you had to like, there were certain like, it's so funny, the only thing that's coming to my mind right now is bookmaking, like literal physical making of books, which is like not actually that complex or interesting. And I'm wondering if that was actually even like a standard major at Santa Cruz. But there was like a little bit of guidelines, like of some basic coursework that you had to complete, and like there were a certain number of courses that you had to create as the major, that had to be somewhat relevant to the subject of study. But it was very, very loose. Like, yeah, I'm sure there were people studying magic and tarot and like all kinds of unusual things. It was a pretty open space for creating an unusual educational experience. And I took some amazing classes there. They had some just like unusual courses, like took one on the Beatles, and one of my favorite classes was on humanistic psychology, which was taught by a clinical psychologist, a trauma-informed clinical psychologist who worked in the area, and had us like doing kind of like rituals as a part of the class, and like going out into nature and engaging with each other and working through our own inner work. And yeah, I think I'm gonna do a little research, Ben, and get back to you because I don't have a good answer. But yeah, it was like very, very open.
I feel like. Oh wait, no, sorry.
Sorry.
Jump in.
I have to leave here in a second, but like many universities do offer interdisciplinary opportunities for degrees. The problem with it, and this is perpetually the problem, and I mean, Sid, maybe you can also attest to this, but for example, complexity science, which is like one of my biggest fascinations, is as a rule, an interdisciplinary field. And it's notoriously difficult to get advisors who are willing to take you on and guide you through educating yourself in something that you've decided you need to know. That's maybe one of the biggest failures of like cookie cutter education, is that when you do want to build your own major, you have to find people who will help you go through that. It's extremely self-directed, and it can be very, I think, from what I've understood, can be a little bit demoralizing, specifically because no one's telling you whether or not you are learning what you need to learn.
I feel like one thing I just want to add is that like, you know, whatever the quote is, like, change the incentives, change the outcome. Grades are just like the ultimate cookie cutter incentive for boiling down effort into like a discrete letter or like a number or whatever. In that, like, if you look to like Evergreen College does narrative assessment, where instead you just get feedback on how you did, and I think that could necessarily maybe like incentivize the how of thinking more so than the what of thinking, not like mastering domain expertise, but it's like, oh, you overthought that, or you maybe didn't think about this. I didn't get narrative assessment. So
Santa Cruz had the same option where you could opt out of grades entirely and just get written feedback and not have any formal traditional grades at all. I didn't do that either. It's like it poses an interesting question if you're trying to apply to grad school, though. You know, by Pan. Oh.
Yeah, no, I did it in high school. Actually, my high school had like this alternative high school within a high school where we had narrative assessment, integrated studies, all that type of stuff. And it did lead itself to a weird sort of problem where it's like when you're applying to colleges. I mean, luckily there's another there's the entrance exam, which is another number you can submit. So don't worry, they got numbers on numbers. There's numbers for that. But yeah, I'm very much fascinated by like, because it doesn't feel like in line with reality that you get feedback discreetly numbered. Like, it's just not how life works. It feels much more mushy and gushy and like, you got this right, but that wrong. Like, yeah, thank you for giving me good feedback. Like, I feel good about that thing I got right and a little bit bad about the thing I got wrong, you know? So I think a much more nuanced, balanced approach is the way you got to do it. Anyways, I don't know. It's cool talking about education stuff. Pass it back there.
If I could jump in for a sec. My father actually ran a series of alternative schools before I was born, and what they tried to do, I think this was a very like 60s and 70s kind of thing, where they would have these study groups, and you could try to get credentials through it if you wanted to by taking equivalency exams. So they were kind of like mirroring existing courses, but trying to sort of teach a better version of that same course, or a more sort of detailed analysis of sort of some of the theory that would be missing from a conventional education. And actually, my mother graduated high school through one of those programs. Just really was not happy in the traditional school system. She was one of the only people who actually got credentials from it, though. Most people really just kind of had these lectures that were set up with various different professors. And, this was a lot of, courses happening, on a lawn somewhere in somebody's living room or whatever. But I think sort of further to what Pan was saying, like, the idea was to kind of give you the ability to be self-directed, but there was these collectives that were coming together, somewhat like what we're doing here in some ways. That were sort of this deliberate attempt to sort of shadow an existing, set of sort of infrastructure set up by the state. The tiny little sort of attempt at that I did myself was when studying economics in college. I followed along in the ecological economics textbooks to sort of learn the same thing, but from another perspective, and try to understand the critique of kind of conventional economics, but still try to get my grades at the same time, and have a more interesting set of things to say when I showed up at class to sort of challenge the professor with or whatever. So yeah, I wonder if there's like ways we can think about kind of retrofitting the existing infrastructure that we have, as opposed to sort of tearing it all down and starting from scratch, because so often that's the challenge we find is like, here we have all this existing infrastructure and all this momentum behind it and resources, and yet our vision is perhaps completely different. How do we get from here to there?
Thank you so much for sharing them. That's amazing that you have direct experience with alternative education and stuff.
Yeah.
There's some spicier parts of that story, but I'll share that over beer some other time.
Ooh.
Perhaps
So-
in a future library call.
Yeah, so I was gonna say that like we've done our 1 hour of talking, and I know that it's 1 a.m. Bianca's time, so like no pressure for anyone to stick around. I'm happy to stick around and keep this call going for as long as possible. But that was a really good conversation. I just want to give a little appreciation to our speaker of the week, Bianca. Thank you so much for a really interesting conversation.
Woo!
Thank you,
Bianca! Thank you,
Bianca.
Bianca!
Bridging with me, like really energetically. I really appreciate it. Oh yeah, definitely check out like Cortland Lear's work, like really, yeah. And yeah, I'm so excited for like just Web3 Times education initiatives like upcoming in this space. Like right now I'm working on something with crypto culture and society. Hopefully it comes out like maybe Q1 or Q2. But yeah, it basically public good. Feel like everyone will benefit.
Looking
Yeah,
forward
and if
to
you
it.
have any more initiatives that you guys are working on, I'd love to check them out. I've just been like really into like the intersection of these spaces. Yeah, and like support you guys any way I can.
Well, since it's
Decom
germane,
Can you tell me more about the? Thank you for this.
I'd love to learn more because I only was able to catch the first half of the discussion. Unfortunately, my phone died and I had another meeting, but that one just wrapped up. So I saw this was still going. So I was like, let me hop in here. But where can I find the essay you wrote? Because I would love to read it.
Oh, okay. Wait, let me paste the link here. Give me a moment. Here it is. If you are short on time, I made a summary. Let me look for that also on Twitter. You can just quickly go through here.